The orange stray cat would not move from the middle of the road. Rain hammered my windshield, and 3 tiny puppies trembled behind her like broken shadows. I'm a veterinarian, and I've seen a lot of street animals, but cats don't stand off against cars to shield rescued puppies. I slammed on the brakes. When I stepped out into the wet night, the cat turned her head and locked eyes with me. It was a steady, pleading stare that froze me where I stood. She let out a rough, cracked meow, then jumped sideways, paws splashing along the flooded curb. She stopped, checked that I was following, and cried out again, pulling me with her voice more than my feet. Step by step, she led me until we reached an iron storm drain. I leaned over the bars and at first saw only dark water and the reflection of my own face. Then the reflection rippled. 3 muddy, shivering faces stared up at me from the shadows, pressed together so tightly they almost looked like one frightened animal. Tiny paws clung to the rusted metal as the puppies tried to keep themselves above the black water below. Above them, the stray cat climbed onto the grate and crouched there, her tail wrapped tight around her feet as if she were standing guard over her stolen litter. She looked from the puppies to me, and her eyes said everything her voice couldn't. There was no way I was lifting that cover alone. My fingers were already dialing for help while one thought pounded in my head louder than the rain. If those 3 puppies and a cat had been trapped in that storm drain all night, what if I was already too late? The sirens weren't even in earshot yet, and time was already stretching thin while the 3 puppies below me went silent and just stared up through the bars. No more frantic cries, just 3 soaked faces blinking slowly like they were already too tired to ask for help. I gripped the edge of the storm drain and forced my voice to stay low and steady. It's okay. I see you. Stay with me. I murmured into the dark. Because what else do you tell 3 abandoned puppies and a stray cat who refuses to leave? The cat paced in tight circles around the grate, then leaned over the opening and let out that cracked little meow again, as if she was answering for them. One of the puppies, braver or just more desperate, stretched a tiny paw toward the strip of light where her paws stood. The other 2 pressed into his side, trembling against the rusted metal. Finally, I heard it, the faint wail of sirens growing closer. Red and white light washed over the wet pavement as the truck pulled up. The crew jumped out with tools. One of them tried to shoo the cat away from the storm drain with his boot, but she darted back to the edge the second his foot moved. Tail puffed, eyes locked on the puppies. Below, they slid a hook under the iron cover and heaved. The grate groaned and shifted, sending a rush of cold air and the sharp smell of wet asphalt down into the hole. All 3 puppies flinched and squeezed even tighter together. A rescuer climbed down into the dark and lifted each puppy up to me one by one. With every shaking body that passed into my hands, the cat stretched her neck forward, sniffing, checking, making sure her little storm drain family was still there. The last puppy was the smallest. When the rescuer held him up, he barely moved, his soaked tail giving the faintest twitch. I pulled him to my chest, pressing his cold body against my jacket, and one thought cut through everything else. Please don't let me be too late to give him warmth. The first warm sound I heard from them wasn't a bark at all. It was a tiny broken whimper when the warm water finally hit their skin. By the time we reached the clinic, the 3 puppies were just limp, bundles of fur and mud on the back seat, breathing but too tired to complain. The stray cat rode up front in a carrier, soaked whiskers pressed to the bars, never taking her eyes off them. Inside, I laid all 3 puppies on the metal table under a heat lamp, their bodies shivering in little waves. Beside us waited a plastic basin of warm water and a stack of clean towels. They smelled like rust, rain, and fear. When I lowered the first puppy into the basin, he let out that soft, surprised sob, a sound somewhere between relief and pain. Somebody had kept these puppies alive, just long enough to get bored of them, then dropped them into a storm drain, like trash. I turned to the cat. Up close, she was all angles and sharp, lines under that orange fur. Her claws were worn down, pads rough and cracked, a map of every hard surface she'd walked, just to survive. No collar. The scanner stayed quiet for her, too. No records, no home, no one to call. When I carried her back into the room with the puppies, I barely had time to set the carrier down before she forced the door open with her head and jumped out. No hesitation, no fear of my hands or the metal table. She went straight to their bed and climbed in, arranging herself so that her thin body formed a warm curve around all 3 abandoned puppies. Sleepy and weak, they still knew exactly where to go. They crawled toward her, nosing into her chest and belly, draping paws over her legs, clinging to her like children who had finally found something solid. I stood there longer than I needed to, watching a stray cat and 3 unwanted puppies breathe in the same slow rhythm. For the first time since my own loss, something warm pushed against the cold place in my chest. Okay, I told myself, under my breath, you're just patience. For now, you're only patience, right? That evening, when the clinic was almost empty and the lights were turned down, lo, I heard it. One of the puppies had started breathing too fast and too shallow. I bent over his tiny body and watched his chest. It rose and fell like the bellows of an old accordion. Quick, uneven pulls that never seemed to fill him. Each breath came with a faint whistle, the kind that makes your stomach drop before your mind even catches up. Cold, wet nights and tiny. Lungs are a bad mix. Pneumonia was the word sitting at the back of my throat. I set up a small 4-line, my fingers moving on instinct while my brain clung to every heartbeat. Fluids, meds, everything I could give that wouldn't crush his fragile system. I slid his little crate closer to the oxygen unit, letting the soft hiss wrap around him like an invisible blanket. The stray cat paced from corner to corner, tail twitching, eyes locked on that one struggling puppy. Finally, she settled at the crate door, stretching out along the metal, and laid her paw so close to the bars that her fur almost brushed his side. On the other side of her, the other 2 puppies slept pressed against her spine, their tiny bodies forming a living bridge between her and their brother. I stayed. I turned my phone face down in my pocket and let the rest of the world fall away. I'd watched a chest rise and fall like this before, waiting for the moment it just stopped. I wasn't ready to live through that again, not with this little life. Oh, night is breathing danced on a knife edge. Sometimes it steadied soft and regular, and I let myself exhale. Then it would hitch again, sharp and shallow, pulling me right back to the edge of that old familiar cliff. Near dawn, the puppy went so still it felt like the floor dropped out from under me. I lurched to the crate, pressed my ear to his tiny chest, and held my own breath. Please, I thought, don't let the only thing I hear be silence. Instead of silence, I heard the faintest steady inhale and then another. The little puppy's chest lifted under my cheek. Not perfectly, not strongly, but in a rhythm my body recognized as life. His breathing even out in tiny, stubborn waves. The fever on my thermometer ticked down a fraction of a degree at a Time slow as sunrise, but moving in the right direction. Relief didn't feel soft. It hit me like a fist of the ribs. Because in that moment, I knew if this puppy had slipped away in my hands, it wouldn't have been just another case. It would have cracked open the same place. That was barely holding together as it was. The cat, who had not left his crate all night, finally seemed to understand. She could rest. She sat down right there, on the floor, still pressed against the metal bars, and then slowly folded it on, herself, curling into a tight orange ball. She fell asleep, sitting up, head bobbing, as if her body refused to pull. Too far away from her puppies in the making. I reached down without thinking and stroked the fur along her neck, feeling the wiry street tough coat warm under my hand. Good job, girl. I whispered. You did your part, too. Days began to blur in that little corner of the clinic. The 3 puppies started to fill out, ribs softening under new muscle and food. They wobbled on unsure legs, tripped over each other, found the loose end of my shoelace, and gnawed on it like it was the greatest treasure on earth. The cat watched their every move, swatting a nose away from a power cord, hurting them back when they tried to explore beyond their blankets. The better they got, the worse it felt in my chest. Every time one of those puppies leaned against my ankle or fell asleep with his head in my hand, a cold thought slid in behind the warmth. If I keep them and something happens, I don't know if I can survive that again. Logically, I knew what needed to happen. There were rescues, shelters, foster homes, people who specialize in placing litters, people with time, space, and hearts not already held together with old tape. One evening, as I locked the clinic doors and turned back to their corner, I saw them all piled on the cat's side, 3 little hills of fur against one tired orange shoulder. Without planning, 2, I said it out loud. Tomorrow I'll call a shelter. I told the room, I'll do what I'm supposed to do. But when I slid my phone out of my pocket later that night, my fingers hovered over the screen and somehow never made it to the call button. In the morning, I finally did it. I loaded the cat into one carrier, the 3 puppies into another, and every pair of eyes on me looked like they already knew something was wrong. By the time we pulled into the shelter lot, the air was already full of noise. Dogs barking from inside, people carrying boxes and leashes, a child crying because he didn't understand why. The dog he loved was going through those doors. The 3 puppies in there. Carriers started to shake harder as the sounds washed over them, claws scraping uselessly at the plastic floor. The cat still didn't make a sound. She just locked onto my face, pupils blown wide, as if trying to read whether I was about to break the little storm-drained family she'd worked so hard to hold together. I sat there behind the wheel, hands clenched so tight on the steering wheel. My knuckles turned white, logic lined up, every reason like a neat row of charts. Emotion just stood in the corner, arms crossed, waiting for me to admit what this really felt like. Then one of the puppies let out a long, thin sound. Not a bark, not a whine I'd heard before. It cut right through the barking and shouting outside, a needle of pure panic slipping under my ribs. I killed the engine and stared at the shelter sign until the letters blurred. Then I shifted into reverse. Not today, I muttered to myself as we rolled back out of the lot. I'll try again tomorrow. But deep down, I already knew the problem wasn't the day on the calendar. It was me and the way those for faces were starting to feel like home. The next day, I forced myself to go further, not just to the parking lot this time, but all the way to the shelter door, one carrier in each hand, for hearts rattling softly inside. Plastic walls. Inside, the noise hit me before the smell did. barking echoing. Off tile, voices overlapping. Disinfectant, wet fur, stress thick. Enough to taste. I heard a staff member somewhere down the hall say, "We're packed with puppies again. We barely have any space left." I stopped just short of the entrance, fingers tightening around the handles. In the carrier by my left leg, everything shook. One tiny paw thumped against the side again and again like the little body attached to it was trying to claw its way back to somewhere safe. In the other carrier, the cat finally broke her silence. She let out a small, uncertain meow, not the sharp, commanding cry from the road, not the desperate call over the storm drain. This one was softer, almost a question. My mind went back to the clinic without asking permission, to the night I sat on the floor listening for a puppy's next breath, to the way she had stayed glued to that crate, keeping her own vigil as if she decided that if he was going to fight for his life, she would too. My hand drifted toward the shelter door, hovering inches from the handle. All I had to do was pull it open, walk in, sign a few forms, and hand 4 living souls over to a system that would try its best. That was the rational thing, the responsible thing. But my fingers wouldn't close. They just trembled there, in midair, while my heart reminded me exactly who had dragged me to that storm drain in the first place. A second paw hit the side of the puppy carrier. The cat gave one more quiet sound like she was waiting for my decision. I turned around and walked back to the car without ever opening the door. That night, for the first time, they didn't sleep in the clinic. They slept at my house because I couldn't stand the thought of driving them back to an empty building and pretending they were just passing through. On the third day, I told myself out loud, today I do it by the book. I walk in, sign the forms, hand them over to the professionals. That's it. I loaded everyone into the car again, this time trying to ignore the way my chest tightened when the 3 puppies pressed together in their carrier and the cat settled quietly into hers. I reminded myself I was one man, with a full-time job and a heart already patched up more times than it should have been. I couldn't build another whole family around 4 strays. Inside the shelter, the woman at the front desk listened while I explained the storm drain, the rescue, the strange bond between one tired cat and 3 unwanted puppies. She nodded kindly, fingers already moving over her keyboard. "We can take the cat right away," she said. "Our cat room always has space." Then she glanced at the puppies. "For them, it'll be a couple of days until the kennel opens up, or we can transfer them to another shelter out of town." In other words, they'd be separated. While we talked, another staff member, not knowing the story, had already picked up the cat's carrier and turned toward the hallway. The change in the puppy crate was instant. All 3 spun around, claws scrambling, and let out a raw, broken chorus of cries that didn't sound like normal whining at all. The cat heard them and slammed her face against the front of the carrier, nose and whiskers crushed into wire, straining to see them. That sound hit me like deja vu. It was the same thin, desperate cry that had yanked me off the floor of my clinic in the middle of the night. "Stop," I said, sharper than I meant to. "Please, put her down." Then quieter, only for myself, the truth I'd been dodging for days. If she didn't leave them in the rain, what made me think I could leave them now? I grabbed both carriers like someone might try to take them away. Again, one in each hand, and to my own surprise, I felt my mouth pull into a smile. The decision was already made. All that was left was to say it out loud. I turned back to the staff at the desk and let my shoulders drop. "Thank You for your time, I said, voice steady. In a way my heart wasn't. But they've already got a home with me. On the drive. Back, the puppies climbed over each. Other, tiny paws scrambling, trying to see the cat in the other carrier. She pressed her nose to her own door, whiskers brushing the plastic as if counting heads every few seconds to make sure no one had vanished. At the clinic and then at my house, I stopped pretending this was temporary. I set up a soft bed for the cat, a low play pen for the puppies, bowls that matched toys that squeak far too loudly for their size. Clients started asking, "Who are they?" And I heard myself answering with a kind of quiet pride, telling the story like I was talking about my own kids. One afternoon, the puppy who'd scared me, half to death with his breathing crisis, wandered over, wobbly but determined. He laid his head on my knee and let out a long, heavy sigh that sounded so much like the one I'd lost at my chest, clenched. But this time, the pain didn't crush me. It loosened, the memory finally tied itself to survival instead of to an ending. That night, in the dim light of my living room, I watched the cat sleep, with 3 growing puppies draped over her like living blankets. I whispered their names into the dark, one by one, sealing something I'd been fighting for days. From this moment on, I thought, we're not just a rescue case anymore. We're a family. Mornings at the clinic don't start with clanging metal anymore. They start with the patter of 3 sets of small paws and a soft MYRR as the orange cat stretches on her spot by the front desk. The puppies aren't tiny, storm-drained shadows now. They've grown into clumsy, bright-eyed troublemakers who still orbit the same center. If they play too rough in the lobby, the cat lifts a paw and taps a nose, and somehow that quiet little gesture does more than any command I could give. Clients push the door open and smile before they even see me. They're looking for the storm drain. Family now. People tell the story to each other in the waiting room like a local legend, showing photos on their phones. Some film the puppies dozing across the cat's back or following her in a crooked line like fuzzy ducklings. Others drop off toys and treats with notes that just say for the drain crew. I take them home with me and back again, like it's the most natural thing in the world. They nap in my office between appointments, snore under my chair, roam the halls like they're checking on patients. They're not visitors anymore. They're part of the building, part of my days, part of whatever my life is. Turning into now, the clinic's social media starts to pick up. Sure, but that's not what I feel most. What I feel most is a change in my own walls. The house that used to echo with its own emptiness now has 3 puppies and 1 tired cat sprawled in the doorway, breathing warmth into old, quiet rooms. I still carry my loss with me. That hasn't vanished, but it's wrapped now in something gentler, a layer of quiet, gratitude laid over the grief. One evening, I sit on the floor and they settle around me in a loose living circle, bodies pressing into my legs, into each other. I catch myself wondering, not for the first time, how many stories like this are lost because no one ever stops long enough to hear that very first meow for help. I think back to that first rainy night and realize it didn't start with me. And it didn't even start with 3 frightened puppies. It started with 1 stray cat who could have walked past a storm drain and chose instead to stand her ground because she stayed. 3 soaked, shivering puppies got pulled out of the dark instead of disappearing into it. Because she stayed, they ended up here, wrestling over toys and falling asleep, in a pile of paws and whiskers instead of becoming another sad story no one ever heard. Because she stayed, my own life shifted from empty rooms and old Grief to muddy paw prints on clean. Floors and quiet company I didn't know I still needed. All of this happened because one animal cared enough to make noise, and because for once a tired man in a car actually listened. If nobody had stopped, if nobody had bent down to look through those iron bars or picked up a phone to call for help, those 3 little lives would already be gone. So if you're watching this, I hope you remember that. Don't walk past the bark or the meow or the shape in the corner of the parking lot. You're trying not to see. Support the shelters and foster homes and rescue groups in your town, the people who answer those calls in the middle of the night. And please share stories like this one, because every view, every comment, every repost makes it more likely that someone somewhere will hear their own first cry for help in time. This little guy's journey from abandonment to rehabilitation shows how important nonprofit rescue groups really are. Caring for a rescued puppy is more than love, it's responsibility. It's pet care. Join our Brave Paws family. Be their voice. Be their hope.